Beyond the Gates spoilers, Leslie has never been a woman who shares willingly, not space, not loyalty, and certainly not the object of her fixation. In her world, affection is not something negotiated. It is something claimed, guarded, and defended once she has decided it belongs to her. That truth has shaped every move she has made since her attention settled on Ted Richardson. Long before circumstances forced Nicole to retreat, and long before Shanice ever imagined she would find herself standing in the middle of someone else's emotional battlefield, Leslie may present herself as distracted, even entertained by the presence of Detective Marcel Malone, but that diversion is superficial at best. A calculated performance designed to disguise the fact that her emotional compass has never shifted. Ted remains the axis around which her sense of control rotates, the one unresolved conquest she refuses to relinquish, and now that Nicole has stepped aside, Leslie sees the situation not as complicated, but as simplified. In her mind, the path is finally clear, and any new obstacle is not a rival but an intrusion. What unsettles Leslie is not merely the knowledge that Shanice and Ted have grown closer, but the way in which that closeness has crossed an invisible boundary she believed would never be breached without consequence. Casual flirtation in a hospital corridor, shared glances that could be dismissed as professional familiarity, even moments of emotional proximity could all be rationalized, minimized, or quietly absorbed into Leslie's long game. Those were tolerable infractions, things she could pretend not to notice while keeping her grip intact. But a public appearance, a deliberate choice to be seen together in a setting as socially loaded as the country club, transforms what Leslie once viewed as manageable into something dangerously real. It signals intention. It suggests permanence. It tells a story that Leslie did not authorize and refuses to accept. The country club matters not because of luxury or status alone, but because it is a stage where private arrangements become public truths. For Leslie, that evening represents more than a date. It is a declaration she did not consent to, a rewriting of roles in a narrative she believed she was directing. Watching Ted and Shanice occupy that space together forces Leslie to confront an uncomfortable reality. Her assumption that time, patience, and persistence would eventually secure Ted's attention may have been dangerously flawed. Shanice is not lingering on the margins. She is stepping fully into the center, unafraid to be seen, unashamed of the connection she has built, and that confidence is precisely what Leslie finds most threatening. When Leslie confronts Shanice again, it is not driven by impulse, but by calculation sharpened through resentment. This is not the first time Leslie has tested Shanice's resolve, but it is the first time the stakes feel irreversible. Leslie approaches the situation with the certainty of someone who believes history, effort, and emotional investment entitle her to precedence. She frames the conflict not as competition, but as correction, as though Shanice has wandered into territory already marked and must now be reminded of boundaries she chose to ignore. Leslie's posture is one of ownership rather than desire, and in her mind, asserting that ownership is not aggression but restoration of order. What Leslie does not anticipate, however, is the extent to which Shanice has changed. The woman standing opposite her is no longer tentative, no longer inclined to shrink under implication or intimidation. Shanice has crossed her own internal threshold, one forged through vulnerability, risk, and the quiet decision to stop apologizing for emotions she did not steal. Her relationship with Ted has not been built in secrecy or manipulation, but through mutual recognition, shared trust, and the gradual dismantling of emotional defenses on both sides. That foundation gives Shanice a steadiness Leslie did not expect and cannot easily destabilize. The confrontation escalates not because voices are raised or threats are issued, but because neither woman is willing to retreat. Leslie presses her claim with an intensity that borders on obsession, framing Ted as someone she has waited for, invested in, and therefore earned. Shanice, in contrast, refuses the premise entirely. She does not see affection as a prize awarded for persistence, nor does she accept the idea that timing grants ownership over another person's choices. This ideological divide fuels the tension, turning the encounter into more than a personal dispute. It becomes a collision between two fundamentally different understandings of love, agency, and entitlement. For Leslie, Shanice's resistance is not merely defiance. It is betrayal of an unspoken hierarchy Leslie assumed everyone recognized. The refusal to step aside, to defer, or to acknowledge Leslie's perceived claim fractures Leslie's sense of control. It forces her to confront a possibility she has long denied, that Ted's feelings may not align with the narrative she constructed, and that her proximity to him, no matter how long-standing or intense, does not guarantee reciprocity. That realization festers beneath the surface, hardening into resolve rather than humility. Leslie does not retreat from the conflict. She internalizes it, reshaping her strategy even as the confrontation ends without the submission she sought. The aftermath leaves both women altered. Shanice emerges with a clearer understanding of the threat Leslie represents, not just emotionally, but strategically. Leslie is not impulsive, not reckless in the traditional sense. She is deliberate, patient, and willing to wait for the right moment to reclaim ground she believes is hers. That awareness forces Shanice to reckon with the cost of standing her ground, to accept that choosing Ted also means accepting the scrutiny, pressure, and psychological warfare that may follow. Yet she does not waver. The clarity she feels about her connection to Ted outweighs the discomfort of opposition, and that certainty becomes her armor. While this emotional standoff unfolds, a parallel thread quietly advances elsewhere, one defined by secrecy rather than confrontation. Jacob, operating far from the overt drama, begins his own mission with the understanding that visibility is the enemy of success. His task is not fueled by passion or rivalry, but by calculation and necessity. Whatever his objective, it requires discretion, patience, and the ability to move through spaces unnoticed. Unlike Leslie and Shanice, whose conflict thrives on recognition and acknowledgement, Jacob's work depends on remaining unseen, on allowing others to underestimate both his presence and his intent. Jacob's involvement introduces a subtle but significant shift in the larger landscape. While the emotional clash between Leslie and Shanice commands attention, Jacob's covert actions operate beneath the surface, potentially reshaping outcomes without ever announcing themselves. His mission suggests that forces beyond romantic rivalry are in motion, that personal conflicts may soon intersect with broader consequences neither woman has fully considered. The timing is not coincidental. As Leslie grows more determined to assert control and Shanice becomes more resolute in defending her choices, Jacob's quiet maneuvers hint at an approaching convergence where private decisions may trigger public fallout. Together, these developments create a pressure cooker environment in which emotion, ambition, and secrecy feed into one another. Wesley's refusal to share, Shanice's refusal to surrender, and Jacob's refusal to be seen all push the story toward a moment of reckoning. The confrontation at the heart of this arc is not resolved by dominance or retreat, but suspended in a state of unresolved tension, one that promises escalation rather than closure. Leslie leaves the encounter not defeated, but recalibrated. Shanice stands firmer yet more exposed, and Jacob moves forward with his mission intact, unseen but increasingly consequential. What follows will not be determined by who claims ownership the loudest, but by whose strategy endures when the lines between personal desire and calculated action finally collapse. Tracy believed she was doing the right thing when she visited Anita, convinced that honesty delivered with firmness was the most responsible form of love. In her mind, there was no cruelty in refusing to soften the truth, no harm in confronting illness with discipline and resolve rather than indulgence or sentimentality. What Tracy failed to understand was not the severity of Anita's condition, but the emotional terrain that surrounded it. Anita was not searching for correction, structure, or reminders of what she should be doing differently. She was exhausted, physically diminished in ways she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, and emotionally fragile in a way that made Tracy's approach feel less like support and more like judgment. The visit, intended to strengthen Anita, instead reinforced her isolation, leaving behind the sharp realization that even those closest to her could misunderstand what she needed most. Anita's resistance to Tracy's version of love was not born out of stubbornness or denial, but out of survival. Cancer had already stripped her of control over her body, her schedule, and her sense of certainty about the future. What she could not bear was the loss of emotional agency as well, the feeling that her pain had become a problem to be managed rather than an experience to be witnessed. Tracy's insistence on toughness, however well-meaning, felt like another demand placed on a woman who had already been asked to endure too much. Anita did not want lectures disguised as care or expectations framed as encouragement. She wanted presence without pressure, reassurance without correction, and the freedom to be weak without being made to feel inadequate for it. That absence of understanding created space for someone else to step forward, someone who had once seemed an unlikely source of comfort. Sharon, Anita's housemate, had not always been a natural ally. Their relationship began awkwardly, marked by cautious politeness and unspoken doubts about compatibility. Yet adversity has a way of clarifying character, and Sharon proved herself not through grand gestures, but through consistency. She listened when Anita spoke and remained when silence took over. She adapted rather than imposed, offering help in ways that respected Anita's boundaries rather than testing them. Over time, trust replaced hesitation, and Sharon became not just a companion but an anchor, reminding Anita that support did not have to hurt to be sincere. Sharon's loyalty manifested in small, deeply human acts that carried disproportionate emotional weight. She understood that joy, even fleeting joy, mattered in the midst of illness, and that maintaining normalcy was not denial but resistance. Teaching Vernon to sing was not about musical perfection or spectacle. It was about restoring a sense of intimacy and celebration to a household overshadowed by medical appointments and uncertainty. Sharon saw the value in giving Anita something to anticipate, something that belonged to life rather than illness, and she worked quietly to make that possible. The effort symbolized everything Tracy's visit had lacked: empathy without agenda, strength without force, love without conditions. Anita's reliance on Sharon did not diminish her bond with Vernon, but it reshaped it. Watching her husband practice, struggle, and persist in learning something entirely outside his comfort zone reminded Anita that she was still cherished not as a patient but as a partner. It reaffirmed that she was not defined solely by her diagnosis, that she remained worthy of romance, surprise, and celebration. In a world increasingly reduced to test results and treatment plans, those moments reclaimed pieces of her identity Tracy's approach had unintentionally threatened. While Anita navigated the deeply personal battle of illness and emotional survival, Jacob found himself on the verge of a professional breakthrough that carried its own form of danger. His investigative instincts, sharpened through patience and persistence, led him to uncover a criminal enterprise operating far outside the usual parameters of organized crime. This was not a network fueled by narcotics or conventional financial schemes, but a shadow industry trafficking in human plasma, exploiting a global demand that transformed desperation into profit. Jacob understood immediately that the implications were vast, extending beyond local jurisdiction into a lucrative, ethically grotesque marketplace where bodies became commodities. This discovery marked a defining moment in Jacob's career. It validated his abilities while simultaneously confronting him with a level of risk he had not yet faced. The operation was sophisticated, insulated by legality's gray areas, and protected by layers of intermediaries who ensured accountability never reached the top. Jacob's insight cracked the surface, revealing a structure that demanded infiltration rather than observation. The opportunity was enormous, but so was the cost, and Jacob knew that success would require more than intelligence. It would require trust from superiors who were not yet convinced he deserved it. Helen's decision to authorize Jacob's infiltration represented both confidence and calculation. Allowing a relatively young investigator to embed himself within such an operation was not standard procedure, and the approval carried the weight of expectation. For Jacob, it signaled recognition of his potential, but it also placed him in unprecedented danger. This was not surveillance from a distance or controlled engagement. This was immersion, exposure, and the constant risk of discovery. Jacob accepted without hesitation, driven by a conviction that the mission mattered more than his own safety, and perhaps by a need to prove himself independent of his lineage. That lineage, however, complicated everything. Malone's skepticism toward Jacob was not personal, but institutional, rooted in a belief that the son of a sheriff could never truly be free of inherited protection or an earned privilege. To Malone, Jacob represented a liability as much as an asset, someone whose presence could compromise an operation simply by association. Trust in this environment was not freely given, and Jacob felt the weight of every doubt cast upon him. Rather than deterring him, that suspicion hardened his resolve. He did not seek approval, he sought results. Jacob's determination to proceed, despite resistance and uncertainty, mirrored the quiet defiance Anita displayed in her own struggle. Both were navigating systems that underestimated their resilience, both confronting challenges that demanded emotional endurance as much as strategic thinking. Where Anita resisted being reduced to her illness, Jacob resisted being defined by his parentage. Each, in their own way, fought to assert identity and agency within structures that threatened to subsume them. As the week unfolds, these parallel narratives begin to reflect one another in tone, if not in circumstance. Anita's world contracts inward, focused on survival, comfort, and the careful selection of who is allowed close. Jacob's world expands outward, pulling him deeper into danger under the guise of progress. Support, trust, and misunderstanding become recurring themes, shaping outcomes in ways neither fully anticipates. Tracy's mistake lingers as a cautionary example of how good intentions can wound when empathy is absent, while Sharon's steady presence illustrates the transformative power of simply being there. Meanwhile, Jacob steps forward into a mission that promises advancement but threatens to cost him more than his career if it goes wrong. Nothing about these developments offers easy resolution. Anita's illness does not pause for reconciliation, and Jacob's investigation does not allow for second chances. What connects these stories is not coincidence, but consequence, the understanding that every choice, whether rooted in love or ambition, carries ripples that extend beyond their origin. As support shifts, alliances are tested, and risks escalate, the sense grows that each character is approaching a threshold where endurance alone will no longer be enough. What comes next will demand clarity, sacrifice, and a reckoning with truths that cannot be softened, no matter how well they are intended.